Okay, guys. So I want to get started soon. So can everyone here, first of all, can we like the video and can we share it on the on every single social media platform there is? Sangar zaba wasam your tweet welcome Instagram kim share che inshallah da جرت رجرة يشروكو ما وال ما لا أغا طرحة كمي درتو ولا
Oh,
أغا
Dilbara
دي بيات
Sahari.
ده.
Oh, oh, بالكل. We're having a rough day today, guys. Streaming ain't easy.
It ain't. أو تويتر كده دارلين كاتش ولا يا أنا.
Twitter Kyo Tyson Furry says, "Why you promoting fake news about Kabul University?" Good question, bro. I also fell for the fake news, but alhamdulillah, friends in Kabul said that it's not true. I assume that the failing New York Times knows what they're doing, but apparently the failing New York Times is also spreading fake news, so I fell for it. Yes, maybe we were hacked. That could be a possibility. No, guys, we weren't hacked. Basically, what's happening is that, as you are well aware, we are trying to improve this platform. We have received a lot of help from you guys in the last couple of months, and um, we have switched to Zoom because, yeah, Zoom has some benefits, and fixing Zoom audio and video together, during the stream, it wasn't really working properly. Initially, a few days ago, when I did the tests, everything was fine, but today, for some reason, it didn't work. Uh, but that's why we had to switch back to Skype. But inshallah, we will go back to Zoom when the audio issues are resolved, and then you will have good audio, good video, everything good. Not perfect, but good, decent. But still, we're working on it.
It's still a work in progress. Okay, so Sangar, what did you? So right now we have a couple of people in the chat. So I'm noticing that the number of viewers we have does not correspond to the amount of likes we have. And I know everyone's probably thinking this guy with his likes insistence, but I'm not going to relent on that. So guys, can we please like the video? And one last time before we get started, can we please share on the different social media platforms so other people can can find the stream, please?
Okay. Enzimamul Hassan is asking, what is drought situation in Afghanistan, and is there hope of economic condition recovering in near future? Very good question. We will try to answer that quickly at the end of the show. Today, most important matter is the announcement of the Islamic Emirates of Afghanistan that they will uh, going to reintroduce the constitution of 1964 during the time of King Zahir Shah. This is a very significant development because that document uh, is that constitution has many implications, and my dear friend Ahmed-waleed Kakar, who is a historian and he has studied that document thoroughly, he is going to explain what this entails. So we will talk about the constitution and what it means for current situation in Afghanistan, and we will answer a few questions. Uh, yeah, the robotic voice is because I'm a little bit sick, and that's why I sound like this when I'm sick. And under normal circumstances, I have a different voice.
All right, so let's go. So before we get started, right? Before we get started on the what this constitution was, what the background to the constitution of 1964 was, we're going to read out the statement of Abdul Hakim Shari'i, who is the acting Minister of Justice of the Islamic Emirate. So he said, quote, the statement read as follows, quote, the Islamic Emirate or Afghanistan will implement the constitutional law of the former king Mohammad Zahir Shah for a temporary period without any content that contradicts Islamic laws and the principles of the of the Islamic Emirate. So, will implement the constitutional law of the former king Mohammad Zahir Shah for a temporary period without any content that contradicts Islamic law and the principles of the Islamic Emirate, i.e., the Taliban. So, what does that actually mean? Well, in order to find out what that means, we need to go. Bahar Khan is saying, could I ask Ahmed-waleed, what are you drinking, bro? Dark coffee, black coffee. Sorry, if I make any sort of typos or misread anything, it's because it's 11:11 p.m. in the UK. I worked all day, got stuck in the rain, a couple of other things, but we're here. So despite me being tired, we're still going to go through this and discuss the significance of what this actually means. But in advance, I'm going to request or humbly apologize for any sort of slip ups or typos I do. I'm not in the most energized state of mind I could be in, which is why I'm actually drinking the coffee. So, the 1964 Constitution has its own history, and we'll get into the history of that and the history of constitutionalism and constitutional politics in Afghanistan. We'll get into that, okay? But essentially, the 1964 Constitution was what made Afghanistan a constitutional monarchy. It provided for a bicameral legislature, so an upper house and lower house of parliament. The lower house, the Walasi Jirga, or the People's Assembly, was to be elected. It essentially unified, contrary to previous constitutions, it unified the Sharia courts and the state courts together. So previous to this, there was another constitution, which we'll discuss briefly as well, which basically provided for separate realms according to which the state would have its own courts and the Sharia would have, the religious scholars would have their own courts, and they'd sort of exist in harmony with each other, and the religious courts would predominate. The 1964 law essentially provided that the state law and religious law would be accommodated in the same courts. However, so a lot of people would say that makes state law predominant over religious law because state law is enacted through bills in parliament. However, the constitution also had a clause that no law shall contravene the principles of Islam, and that Afghanistan was a Hanafi Islamic state. Another part of the constitution, and we've discussed it in the podcast on Dawood Khan, was that it disallowed members of the then royal family from pursuing political office, and that was something that many people felt was targeted against the king's cousin and the former prime minister Sardar Mohammad Dawood Khan. And it didn't end too well because Sardar Mohammad Dawood Khan actually overthrew the king, his cousin, and this constitution was essentially annulled. A new constitution was promulgated. So the Taliban are basically saying, for the time being, we are going to enact this constitution. Now, why is that significant? Well, because this constitution actually served as the inspiration for the 2004 constitution, which the Taliban did not accept, right? So on the one hand, the Taliban did not accept the 2004 constitution modeled upon this 1964 one. And on the other hand, the Taliban are saying that, well, we're going to use this constitution as long as it, the bits that don't contravene Islam. Now, the question arises, Sangar, who decides what contravenes Islam?
Do the Taliban have a council of shura or something of scholars? Have they introduced any such thing? at the
So
moment?
to the best of my knowledge, they haven't, but they do have a shura of scholars, including the current Rais al-Wazara, um, Maulawi Hassan Akhund, and we also have Sheikh Abdul Hakim Haqqani, who was the head of the Taliban negotiating team, who hasn't actually been given any position in the cabinet. So when people were saying, "Oh, so and so is missing from the cabinet," a lot of senior people were missing from the cabinet or the initial announcement of the interim cabinet. So they do have a series of scholars, and I guess it would be according to them that it would be decided what does and does not contravene Islam. But I
Oh,
want to ask you,
just
Sankar.
one question.
Hmm.
So, whenever this matter of what is Islamic and what is not Islamic is being discussed, uh, a common response is, well, according to whom? Like,
Hmm.
who has, like, there are many different interpretations of many aspects of Islam. Um, but here they say that the constitution is according to the Hanafi school of jurisprudence.
Hmm.
So, would it be fair to assume that everyone knows what Hanafi fiqh is in Afghanistan, or is that even within Hanafi fiqh we can say, oh, there are different interpretations?
Exactly. That is exactly what the case is. So we come back to the question of who's actually deciding what does and what does not contravene the sacred principles of Islam. But I want to ask you, Sangar, before we sort of get into so right now, today, we're going to be discussing the the rationale behind the Taliban doing this and the background to the 1964 constitution. But before that, Sangat, I want to ask you, did this announcement surprise you?
Um, I would say that it's not like a surprise in the sense of that, oh, I didn't expect them to do that. I just didn't expect this to happen now. Okay?
Hmm.
Uh, because we know that the Taliban have in the past shown some sort of preference for the old constitution. And I think you are well aware of that. Uh, but what I knew is that they are not going to announce a new government and just pull out a new constitution out of their pocket. Uh, that was not going to happen. Okay, uh, it's just that it is a surprise that they have announced it now. What I do think that is very interesting, something that I would like to know, is what aspect of this constitution is according to them un-Islamic. I want answers. I want to know
Hmm.
what, because obviously they have something in mind, but they haven't made any specific statements regarding that.
And that's
So
very characteristic of them.
yeah,
They play the
have you
long game.
the sources that you talk to, have you heard anything? Have they told you anything?
Not really, no.
Okay.
Um, but I would assume that the provisions that allow for women to theoretically run for high office, the provisions of elections to some extent, I would say that those we're probably going to see those either being totally sort of disbanded or altered or modified or whichever way you want to look at these things. But I think before we get into this constitution in terms of 1964 and in terms of how this goes back to Amanullah Khan's period, I think there are a number of things that we need to note with regard to the rationale behind why they would do this. So the 1964 constitution at its time
Mm.
was seen as one of the most progressive constitutions in the Islamic world, right? It was praised. A lot of people sort of saw it as a step in the right direction. The king certainly sort of wanted to see a more democratic Afghanistan, but I'm cautious about using the word democratic because it's very loaded, because it has an entire philosophy associated with it that can at times be situated awkwardly in predominantly Muslim societies. So when I say democratic here, I'm not talking about it in the sense of a Western liberal democracy. However, I am talking about in the sense that people would be able to exercise more of a say in the government that governs that. People would have more say in sort of how they are represented by any sort of governance. But however, so there are a couple of things here. So first of all, right, do you remember Sangar? So just to bring it to the 2004 Constitution, what's different between the 2004 and 1964 Constitution is that 2004 did not mention the Hanafi madhab as the sort of the religion of the rituals of the land.
Yeah,
Okay?
exactly.
The 2004 madhab dropped that. Actually, it was dropped by Sardar Dawood in the 1970s, and the communists dropped it, and Dr. Najib never brought it back until the Mujahideen and the Taliban brought it back. But they never enjoyed.
Can you maybe explain why they dropped that? Why did Dawood drop it?
Dawood was a modernist. And essentially, Dawood was very big on being a sort of a statist, secular kind of dictator. So I would say that, by mentioning the Hanafi madhab specifically, it opens up a lot of doors as to a specific criterion by which Islamic law is considered or is not considered. So when Dawood came out with his constitution and basically said, yeah, anything that's against this is going to be passed through, it's a very vague and generic sort of passing reference. By specifying the Hanafi madhab, you've basically symbolically at least given a lot of scholars or mullahs or clerics in Afghanistan power, because you've mentioned something with which they can identify very strongly. Whereas if there's just a preamble saying, yes, nothing against Islam, then, it's just a comment in the passing.
Yeah, so that's something that I also believed, that maybe the reason why they didn't want to specify Hanafi madhab. But you were saying 2004 constitution?
So after Dawood dropped the reference to Hanafi madhab, the communists also didn't bring it back naturally. Right, the communists didn't bring back the Hanafi madhab. They said Islam and democratic legality would not be violated. And then Najib came back. Then the Mujahideen in the 90s tried to come up with a constitution that was never implemented because of the civil war. The Taliban sort of came up with an interim constitution. Those did bring back the Hanafi madhab. But in practicality, they were meaningless because of the circumstances on the ground. The 2004 constitution was the first legitimate legal government, right, since the government of Zahir Shah, or rather since the government of Dawood Khan. It didn't bring back the Hanafi madhab, right? So the Taliban, if we remember, fast forward to 2020, when the Taliban in the intra-Afghan negotiations, they basically approached Ashraf Ghani's team and they said, we want to resolve all of our differences according to Hanafi fiqh. There was a global outcry because everyone said this means that minorities are going to be marginalized, minorities are going to be killed, right? But this was basically the standard procedure which the Taliban offered to the government negotiating team, saying, if things go badly, this is the pattern we all pursue, and if things go south, we're going to resolve it according to Hanafi fiqh. It made the rounds, right? Which showed that because the 2004 constitution didn't actually enshrine Hanafi fiqh as the law of the land, right, because of inclusivity and minority rights and those sorts of concepts, the Taliban attempting to go back to that status quo of the Hanafi fiqh was met with a really sharp reaction. So by going to the 1964 constitution, which was progressive and democratic and legitimate, what the Taliban have actually done is they've basically indirectly, they've adopted it, well, directly, but indirectly, they've gone back to Hanafi fiqh is the law of the land. You see? So it's actually a very intelligent. It's a Hanafi conspiracy because without actually saying it aloud, they've basically picked the last constitution the last legitimate constitution, globally recognized constitution, in which Hanafi fiqh was still upheld as the law of the land.
This
That's
is
number
going
one.
to
Now,
also upset the
obviously,
Salafis.
oh yeah, of course, and it'll be where we could talk very in passing about Daesh and the significance of this, but essentially, this is what the Taliban have done. It's they've, from their perspective, they've killed two birds with one stone. So they've basically gone back to a legitimate constitution that they can interpret as they want, with a blank card, because that constitution was progressive. But now, who's going to be the one calling the shots on what is and what is not Islamic?
Yeah.
It's going to be the Taliban, right? So that is essentially it. And if we
But wait.
so
Just one
once
second.
again,
Okay.
no
We
law.
can
Okay.
we can look at this in a very cynical way and say that basically they did this as a conspiracy to get most. Yeah, but
I wouldn't use the
yeah,
word conspiracy though. I'd just say politics.
To be fair, I think this move to go back to the old constitution, and a constitution that specifically mentions Hanafi fiqh. Guys, is my audio better now? Can you hear me properly? You know, what it creates, in my opinion, is a situation where everyone knows who and what they're dealing with. Because, see, I don't like this obscurantist attitude of a lot of modernists, like, we don't know what the right interpretation of Islam is. We don't know according to whom. I don't like that. I think that's a deliberate way of delegitimizing any claim about Islamic authority as accepted normative Islam. With regards to Hanafi fiqh, we know that Hanafi fiqh was the jurisprudence of the Mughals, the Ottomans, Afghanistan. Basically, the largest part of the Islamic world has been Hanafi for hundreds and hundreds of years. So everyone should know what Hanafi fiqh means. We have scholars of Hanafi fiqh, not just in Afghanistan, but also in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Turkey, Syria. So it's a move towards more clarity, more clarity, and I am very critical of these modern Islamist type of way of thinking about constitution, state, etc., because I think that they're trying to reinvent the wheel, okay, as they say in Dutch. They're reinventing something that already exists. We know that throughout the years, throughout the centuries before emergence of modern nation states, Muslims had a pretty clear idea of what is the role of state in a society. But now we have a modern nation state, so obviously we have to adapt to this modern situation. And I may sound very biased. I'm not very big on madhahib, but I do think that when you say this country is Hanafi fiqh is is how we interpret law in this country, then you can be very specific about how to solve matters, how you're going to deal with matters according to Hanafi fiqh, its principles, its methods of deriving new rulings, and it's a very pragmatic and practical school. This is why it's so widespread around the world. This is why you even see Hanafi scholars being consulted by the Saudi Permanent Standing Committee of Scholars. They approach Hanafi scholars for advice in certain matters. Taqi Usmani, who is a very famous Pakistani scholar, he is basically the authority on Hanafi fiqh in the subcontinent. And when we have that kind of tradition and legacy of Hanafi fiqh in our region, I think, it also empowers a lot of people to criticize Taliban on certain matters. Like they say, this is going to be our constitution and we're going to implement laws according to the Hanafi understanding of Sharia, etc. Then suppose there is something that people disagree with, we can say, okay, well, it's not a uh, widely held view within the Hanafi school of law because uh, there are scholarly opinions about that. But before this situation, it was very difficult to hold Taliban accountable, hold someone else accountable, because okay, according to what system, according to what law are you going to implement this new ruling or do this? But now we know. Now we can hold them accountable. Okay, say now we can say, okay, you want to go around and ask people why their beard is too short. Where in the Hanafi books did you have? Did you see that this is a legitimate way of basically infringing in people's uh, private life?
No, I wouldn't say, I'm just sort of whether or not Hanafi fiqh is the way forward for Afghanistan, in terms of the legislature. That's not really something that I'm going to comment on, and it's not something that I'm qualified to comment on. But essentially, that is how I interpret the 1964 constitution being selected, in my view. It's the last popularly approved of constitution, the last one with national, international legitimacy. And it has that clause to it where the Taliban can sort of turn back the clock to a time which they see as being more befitting of how Afghanistan's laws should be formulated, and in which they can be the driver's seat. Because now, once again, 1964 constitution, nothing should contravene the principles of Islam. But now, because Islam has been defined as in Afghanistan as being the Hanafi fiqh, then they can decide via the Ministry of Justice or Supreme Court justices or people in the legislature, they can decide, people that think like them or people that are them, they can decide what is and what is not Islamic. Because in Afghanistan at the moment, the Deobandi sort of strain within Hanafi madhab is the more predominant one. Now, obviously, there's also the fact that the judiciary is technically theirs, right?
Yeah.
That the state is basically defined as belonging to one madhab. But obviously, a part of this constitution was also elections. It provided for elections to the legislature. And if we, yeah, Sangar has just disappeared for a second. I believe he's coughing. But if we look at the 1960s and the 1970s, the decade of democracy, people were elected to the legislature. One of the people in the legislature was Maulawi Muhammad Nabi Muhammadi, who later went on to found Harakat Inqilab Islami, who was a mujahid from Logar. Other members of the legislature included Babrak Karmal and Aitara Tibzad. So people were elected to these legislatures. Now, knowing what we know about the Taliban's view toward democracy, popular representation, and whatever, I would suspect that those clauses of the 1964 constitution would either be viewed as being un-Islamic because they're democratic, or being impractical because of the sheer military exercise of holding elections within Afghanistan. However, that isn't to say that we will, the whole idea of a representative body is to be ruled out, because Afghanistan, and we've discussed this on our podcast before, because the central state has historically been so weak at a local level, assemblies, councils exist in which tribal elders, village elders can basically act as representatives of their people at the local level. Right now, that's obviously different from them being members of parliament and so on and so forth. But I don't want to say primordial sense, or I don't even want to say a primitive sense, but in the non-state sense, right? In the apolitical sense, you could consider those tribal village elders to be representatives of their people, right? Now, another feature of the 1964 Constitution was, like I said, in theory, state law was superior to religious law. Now, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that in the Constitution it says the laws of Ali Hazrat Muhammad Zahir Shah supersede that of God. No, what it says, what that means is that laws are enacted either, I believe, by being proposed by the king or by the legislature. If those laws are signed, they are signed if they do not contravene Islam. So they can originate in things that are not strictly speaking Islamic, but if they're deemed to be un Islamic, then they will not pass. Which once again comes to the question of who decides, right? What is and what isn't Islamic, because we're going to have a bit of a disagreement with certain things. And what's interesting about the 1964 Constitution, a man that we spoke about, Sangar, in our Dawood Khan podcast, was Mohammed Musa Shafiq. So the 1964 Constitution, Mohammed Musa Shafiq was part of the commission that basically advised on the creation of that constitution. What a lot of people don't know is that his father was also part of that commission, right? So his father was a man called Mawlawi Kamawi, and they essentially debated between themselves as to which shape this constitution should take. So Mawlawi Kamawi was essentially saying that Hanafi fiqh, Hanafi law, must be mentioned by name, whereas Musa Shafiq was essentially arguing that the state law can incorporate religious law and supersede religious law. And that is why you had both. You had Hanafi fiqh being mentioned, and you had state law basically incorporating religious law. But yeah, that is essentially the history of the 1964 Constitution. And it obviously has its own background, and other constitutions came thereafter as well.
Yeah. One of the questions is there a form of checks and balances in the Constitution? Yes, Walid mentioned at the start of the stream that the Constitution of 1964 is basically a state where there are two chambers, the upper house and the lower house. So in Afghanistan, we call that Mashrano Jirga and Walasi Jirga. So the Mashrano Jirga is like the Senate, and Walasi Jirga is the parliament, the lower chamber, or the second chamber as it's called in the Netherlands. What's important is that with regards to checks and balances, now, as far as I know, the Hanafi scholars of the subcontinent, they have different opinions, obviously, but they do not say categorically that having elections is haram and that you cannot have elections. There are views among Ahnaf that you can have elections. I think that one of the most important things that we should really be cautious of is that in any state, in any government, the law of the land is always based on that country's tradition. Now, there is something that most people don't know, and might be quite shocking for most of you, is that the Netherlands, its legal system, has borrowed a lot from Maliki school of fiqh. So Maliki madhab, which is the madhab predominantly in North Africa, has played a major role in how laws are developed in the Netherlands, and this has been the case since the Napoleon era. So Napoleon Bonaparte, he conquered Egypt centuries ago, and he got acquainted with the way the Muslim state was being governed and the way the law was being formulated. And Muslims were centuries ahead of Europeans in the way they dealt with law. And that's something that Napoleon Bonaparte took with him when he became basically the emperor of Europe. And the laws in France have been influenced by Maliki school of thought. and because the Netherlands was also occupied by the French for a while, uh, uh, they have also had these influences from the Maliki school of thought. There is a professor, constitutional professor here in the Netherlands. His name is Tom Zwart, or Tom de Zwart, and he has appeared on many Muslim talk shows here in the Netherlands, where he basically explained that if in the Netherlands people say we don't want Sharia law in this country, you hear that in all these anti-Muslim groups, we don't want Sharia law. He said, well, I have bad news for you, because the Netherlands has Sharia law. And Sharia law was introduced in the Netherlands by non-Muslims, people who didn't believe in Islam, but the legal system that Muslims have developed over the centuries is a system that is so formulated and so developed that even non-Muslims can use some aspects of Islamic law. So when the Taliban say we want Sharia law and we want an Islamic government, everybody assumes that it all entails chopping off hands and chopping off heads and etc. etc. But that's a very simplistic and very narrow understanding of law, and in my opinion, if any state in the Muslim world is very specific about how they want to approach law by specifically stating we're going to rely on Hanafi fiqh, it actually makes things much more clear. I said it before, and I will say it again. This is actually a positive development. This will make things much more clear for everyone to understand, okay, what are we dealing with? Hanafi fiqh is not something very obscure that only some mullahs know about. Everybody can access Hanafi books of fiqh, whether it's Fatawa Hindiya, Alamgiri, the works of Ibn Abidin Shami. There are so many Hanafi, collection of Fatawa and everything that Muslims rely on around the world. And a lot of these works are actually translated into English. You can Google them, you can read what those books say. So from all the things that we have seen in the last month and a half from Taliban, many things that I disapprove, the appointment of certain people and the measures that they have taken, yes, they are very problematic. But this is a development. This needs to be actually accepted as a positive development, because this makes sense. This gives me some sort of perspective of what they are trying to achieve, what kind of state they have in mind, how they want to deal with law, with legality, all these matters. Now, one of the points that some people have raised is that, well, they are Deobandis, and Deobandis have no experience in state building. I would like to hear your comment on that. What do you think when they say these guys are Deobandis and Deobandis have never created a state?
I don't. Okay, I don't think it's without merit, and that's not with any disrespect intended to Deobandis. So here's the thing, right? You mentioned earlier, Sangar, that, and once again, the Shari'i ulum ki ze mutakhassis nayum, I'm not an expert. So if anyone more learned than me when it comes to sort of fiqh with regard to statecraft, if anyone more learned than me notices I make a mistake or disagrees, please let me know. But let me say this, right? We understand, like you said, that the Hanafi madhab is very sort of, like you said, pragmatic and flexible, and correct me if I'm wrong, places a large emphasis on prevailing circumstances on the ground.
Orf.
Yes. Yeah, custom, whatever, right? So, and prevailing circumstances on the ground, al-waqi', orf, these things are constantly in flux. They're changing, right? So when it comes to governance, right, when we look at, let's say, Mughal India or the Ottoman Empire and these sorts of things, the approach towards state building has to mature and evolve over not just decades, but over centuries, right? So when they say that the Deobandis don't have experience with that, we need to define what Deobandis are. Now, the Deobandis are Hanafis, right? The Deobandis are Hanafis, but they're a revivalist school of the Hanafi madhab specific to the subcontinent, right? So it's not that Deobandis are totally clueless, but it's approaching the madhab from the perspective that they do have as a revivalist thought, as we can say, and I'm not saying reactionary in a derogative manner, but reactionary also against the influence of colonialism. They don't, they haven't had the chance to develop sort of statecraft, lawmaking, etc., in the post-colonial context, because as a movement, it's only, I mean, we could trace it back to Shah Waliullah Dehlawi, but let's say 200 years, right? So
Not even that,
right,
even less than
but
that. Yes,
do you
yeah,
see what like?
yeah,
I'm talking about the ideological nucleus of it.
yeah,
We could say 200-300 years if we're being
yes,
generous. So that's not something that is, I would say, necessarily derogatory or disrespectful to the Deobandis, but it's that, you know, the Ottomans, the Mughals, their statecraft developed over centuries, right?
yeah.
And if statecraft takes into account prevailing circumstances, the Deobandis have not had that chance in a post-colonial context.
Yes, and I think that it's also important to note that some of the concerns that people have is, well, if the state is Hanafi and Islamic, what about minorities? Now, this question, I see people ask this question, and you know, during the peace negotiations in Doha, when the Taliban demanded that everything should be governed by Hanafi fiqh, these concerns were raised. Now, this kind of reasoning implies that according to Hanafi fiqh, the minorities have no rights, or that minorities have never had rights in states where the law was Hanafi, and this is just plain ignorance. It's either pretending to be ignorant, or people are really that ignorant to say that,
Yeah.
because the Ahnaf, they have ruled over largest part of the Islamic world. Okay, if the Hanafis were really intolerant towards minorities, then you wouldn't have all these Shia sects in Afghanistan and Turkey and in India. They wouldn't exist. You wouldn't have Hindus, you wouldn't have Sikhs. But on the contrary, wherever the Hanafis have ruled in the last about 1,000 years, all these minorities have flourished. Like in Afghanistan, when did the minorities really start to suffer? In the last 40 years. There were
Or
some,
the last 120 with Amir Abdurrahman. But even then, we
yes,
could say that's sort of a nation state sort of paradigm. But
exactly.
here's
And
the
that's
thing.
why, just to round out my point, is that we have to have an honest conversation about our history, our tradition, our values, and we have to see them not just through a modernist lens where we assume that everything post modernity is great and everything prior to modernity was terrible. Like even here in Europe, if you talk to a lot of Europeans, they have a very unrealistic perspective of how Europe used to be like before modernity. They assume that it was just only oppression and terrible things happened, but that's not actually quite accurate. Like even before modernity, societies were quite tolerant. So tolerance of different views, different perspectives, different religions is not an invention of modernity. People were tolerant before, and they can still be tolerant, and that's exactly the case with Afghanistan, with Hanafi fiqh. And yes, we have many reactionary movements in the Islamic world who see any sort of acceptance or tolerance of people with other views, other beliefs, as something that needs to be crushed. And this is, in my opinion, this is also a modern development. Like centuries ago, people didn't feel the need to go after Shia like Daesh does now. This is something that this is a modern development, and we have to see things as they are. And I also think that we have to maybe elaborate on the history of constitutionalism in Afghanistan. Maybe you can tell us like when was the first constitution announced, and how has that evolved in Afghanistan in the last couple of centuries?
I will do that. But just to add on to your point about the Ottoman Empire, for most of its history, its population was majority non-Muslim, right?
Yeah.
So it just proves the point. And further, I mean, this idea that if the law is based on Hanafi fiqh, then it leads to, everyone needs to be represented. I'm going to be really blunt here, right? I live in the UK, Sankar, right?
Yeah.
I'm a Hanafi, okay? Is my law, and there are millions of Hanafis in the UK, by the way, because of our Pakistani, Bengali brothers that are here. There are millions of Hanafis here, okay? Is our law, do we see our law being taken into account when the government announces its policies?
No.
No.
Obviously not.
And that's the thing. As a minority, as minorities, we accept that deal. They don't interfere with our right to worship, right? We don't pose any harm to society. That is the deal. But when it comes to, let's say, I don't know, when it comes to tax or parking tickets or roadworks or abortion or on anything, is my law taken into account as a minority?
No, absolutely
No.
not.
But like I said, so this, even this thing doesn't even exist in the West, right?
Yeah.
And if we adopt the 2004 approach, where nothing contravenes Islam, it becomes very difficult to actually hold the government to account. But in any case, with regard to the history of constitutionalism in Afghanistan, the 1964 constitution followed what was essentially a long procedure over decades of Afghan intellectuals trying to constitutionalize government. Now, this movement actually started off in the reign of Amir Habibullah Khan. Amir Habibullah was the father of Amanullah, the son of Abdurrahman. Now, in his reign, he basically invited over a couple of exiled families from abroad. He set up his own school, Habibiyah, right? He invited over Indian Muslims to teach at his school. Habibullah was essentially a cautious, careful modernizer reformer. Now, in his time, a movement started to arise. Now, the movement was called Mashrut Khahan, okay? Mashrut means conditional, okay? But in this context, it basically means constitutionalism in the sense that the king's power is not all-encompassing and should be conditional and subject to some sort of constraint. Now, in Mashrut Khahan, one of the key members of it was my great-grandfather, Mawlawi Abdul Wasir. Most of the Mashrut Khahan were actually executed. They were discovered by Amir Habibullah. They were executed, except my great-grandfather. And that was because his father was the personal tutor of Amir Habibullah in Madrasa-e-Shahi, or in the Royal Madrasa. So my great-great-grandfather was Amir Habibullah's tutor, and because of that, he had some leniency with my great-grandfather. Now, Amir Habibullah died in 1919. And by the way, guys, I'm mentioning this not because I'm here like, oh, look at my family. But if you go back to our podcast on Amanullah Khan, I discussed there the role that my great-grandfather played as well, Mawlawi Abdul Wasir, in sort of the constitutionalization of Afghan politics as an alim. Now, Amir Habibullah died in 1919, and after him, Amanullah came along. Now, Amanullah essentially commissioned, amongst others, my great-grandfather to basically write a constitution that would codify what the kingdom was, the relation of the kingdom to its subjects, the relation of the king to its subjects, how law was formulated, all of these things, right? Now, in that, Amanullah did not start off as a secularist, for which he is now notorious. He wanted to basically institutionalize, codify his system of government because he was a modernizer and he believed that Afghanistan needed to be a nation state, a modern nation state, taking into account Islam. Now, in that, religious law and state law basically became equal. Okay, so in Abdul Rahman Khan's time, a pamphlet went out to all of the qazis across Afghanistan, and the book was called Asas al-Quzat, the essentials of being a judge, and it was written by an Alakuzay Mullah. But there was no actual central sort of government bureaucracy in the modern sort of sense. There wasn't sort of a cabinet, there wasn't subordinate ministries, there wasn't a centralized network of courts. My great grandfather wrote a book called Tamassuk al-Quzat, which was basically an upgraded version of Asas al-Quzat, once again, according to the Hanafi madhab, because Sangar, laws, governments, they evolve, right? Now, obviously, Amanullah Khan failed, right? Because a lot of ulama, especially Deobandi ulama, did not like the fact that religious law and state law had basically become equal. But from looking at it from 2021, we can say that Amanullah Khan, the failed constitution that he basically put forward, is basically the blueprint. It was the foundational stone for further constitutions, even though he had to amend it and make it more amenable to his more conservative opponents. So I'm going to read out a quote here, okay? Histories of Afghanistan during the Amanullah era have largely focused on its overthrow at the hands of violent revolts. What is unnoticed is that whilst some of the basic provisions, original provisions of the Nizamnama were later amended, structurally, the 1923 constitution established a model for future Afghan constitutions. Amanullah's constitution was extensively copied in the 1931 constitution and implemented by Nadir Shah. By designing new kinds of government institutions, including a wide-ranging bureaucracy, a cabinet, subordinate ministries, and a centralized network of courts, applying uniform legal codes, Amanullah laid the foundation for the rule of law in the country. Now, we know, right, Amanullah was overthrown. Now, once Amanullah was overthrown, we had Nadir Shah or Nadir Ghadar, depending on which side of the divide you lie. But Nadir's constitution was basically a victory for the conservative camp in Afghanistan. Now, in Nadir's constitution, religious law and state law became separate. Okay, Sangar? They became separate. So religious courts did not have their power sort of constrained by the state. They continued basically to administer justice as and when they saw fit. So, for example, right, one of the Minister of Justice of Nadir's government was a man called Nur al-Mashayikh, okay? And he was a Mujaddidi. He was the Hazrat of Shor Bazar. Now, for those of us who don't know who the Mujaddidis are, the Mujaddidis are basically a family, a clan, descended from Sheikh Sirhindi, who was a revivalist figure in the Naqshbandi tariqa, who fought against what he saw as innovations in the Sufi orders of his time, and he was from Sirhind. He was of Arab descent. So every time you meet an Afghan with the surname Mujaddidi, they probably belong to a clan descended from the Indian sheikh who himself was of Arab ancestry. One of the most famous Mujaddidis we've had in recent time is our one-time president, Sibghatullah Mujaddidi. So they're not ethnically Pashtun, they're not Farsi, they're actually ethnically Arab, but they blend into both ethnicities. Now, Nur al-Mashayikh was a notorious politician. He was on Kalakani's side. He came to Nadir's side. But he was basically the Minister of Justice and pioneered a new sort of government. Okay? Now, you know the Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy anil Munkar, Sangar?
Yes.
Everyone thinks that that was established by the Taliban the first time. Spoiler, it wasn't. It actually existed in the 1930s. So Nur al-Mashayikh, the Mujaddidi Pir, exercised a monopoly on the justice system for a very long, for about 15 years. He established a religious police. Women were required to wear parda. He was the Minister of Justice, and he even established what was the office of muhtasib, right? Which is basically someone who administers and makes sure that people act correctly and righteously. Okay? The parliament of Nadir's constitution consisted of tribal elders and mullahs who were generally picked by Nadir, which was rather convenient. Um, and the parliament was not sort of legislative, it was consultative. Laws were not to contravene the Sharia, and although there was a parliament there, all laws were basically introduced by Nadir or his brothers. Now, this is why the 1964 constitution is significant, right? Because there was no more religious police, right? The legislature became elected, right? And there were certain aspects in which the explicit reference to religion was omitted. So, for example, in the Supreme Court or the judiciary, expert knowledge of the Sharia was not required. Okay. So if we're talking about who decides what is and what isn't Islam, right, in the 1964 constitution, you didn't actually have to be an expert in Islamic law to determine that. Now, this doesn't mean that the constitution was un-Islamic or anti-Islamic, because it also had prime ministers like Maywandwal, like Musa Shafiq, who were very big on basically making the government more and more religious. So to summarize here, right, during Aman Law's time, state law and Sharia were side by side. Okay? They were equal. During Nadir's period, Sharia or religious law superseded state law. Zahir's constitution, state law incorporated religious law, right? And that is a pattern that we've seen repeated through 2004 through to the current announcement by the Taliban. But once again, when state law incorporates religious law, it has to conform, it has to be to the effect that it doesn't contravene Islam. Now, I'm sure you'd agree with me, Sangar, we can be pretty sure that the Taliban are going to be more vigilant about it not contravening Islam than the government of Ali Hazrat Zahir Shah.
Yes, and I think also important to note is that something that we have to basically wait and see how it develops, and that is that the position of the judiciary in Afghanistan. So according to that constitution, if I understand correctly, the judiciary is a separate institution and it has its own like autonomy. You know, in Western countries, we have the the separations of powers. You have the legislative, executive branch, etc. But obviously, we have to have some sort of division of power in our state as well. So do you think that according to that constitution, there will be a autonomous or independent judiciary or not?
See, according to that constitution, who would okay, it's difficult him, okay? The Supreme Court played a role. You didn't need expert religious knowledge to be in the Supreme Court, okay? In order to decide what is and what isn't Islamic, the legislature would be more prominent, okay? But now the legislature was not entirely elected. The king still got his favorites, which is, by the way, what we still have here in the UK. The House of Lords is not an elected body of parliament. Okay.
Even under Ashraf Ghani's reign, it was the same. He appointed people to the Senate.
Exactly. So that is the thing. Even in that elected legislature, you had tribal and religious elders. But I would say, if we're talking about, okay, what I would foresee is that the people in the judiciary going forward, would generally belong to a certain ideological religious stripe. Does that mean that they would necessarily obey everything that Amir says? Yeah, does that mean that their role would solely be to rubber stamp everything that is introduced? I don't think so.
No, and I also I agree that that's not the case. It wasn't the case previously under Ghani's era. Like for instance, when he made Rahila Dostum, Marshal Dostum's daughter, a member of Senate. I don't think that Rahila was planning on doing exactly what Ghani wants her to do. So
Yeah.
yeah.
So yeah, but it's an interesting one, but I think what's very interesting about this specifically is that a lot of people would be like, "Oh, what the hell? Like this is a really liberal, progressive constitution, right?" But here's the thing with constitutions: it's that the theory is not as important as the practicality, right?
Exactly.
That constitution is you you're more than able of that constitution provides enough for you to be as religious, or for the Taliban to be as religious in their governance as they want, right? And it also provides you enough leeway to be as liberal as you want. Now, generally, what we saw up until the last 3 or so years of Zahir Shah's uh, kingship is that generally the state wasn't too keen on getting involved in matters of religion, right? Now, obviously, one of the mistakes the state made was that it allowed too much room for communists, which essentially subverted that status quo. And I know a lot of people are going to be like, how dare you call for repression of communists? But I mean, looking at the last 40 years, I don't think there's another way of looking at it. But even Musa Shafiq, Maiwan Dwal, people like this, these were religious conservatives that held the office of prime minister under the previous constitution. So it's not like it's totally impossible now for the Taliban to be more stringent in their governance. However, what I do suspect is that this will lose the Taliban some of its credibility amongst its more, and I don't want to use the word radical because it doesn't have any meaning. And in my opinion, the most radical thing is believing that a foreign army needs to occupy your country to socially re-engineer it. So I'm not going to use the word radical, but the more of the Taliban's, Salafi jihadi kind of allies, or not even its allies, but that constituency which may be inclined towards it, because wal hukmu lillah, and anyone who doesn't rule by what Allah has said, ordained, is basically a kafir, and all of those sorts of
ومن
things.
لا يحكم بما
وَمَنْ
لا
لَا
ينزل
يحكم.
الله. We've heard it so
Yeah,
many
so
times.
and that obviously includes groups like Daesh, who will,
They will be delighted to hear this, because now they say, you see, these people, they're not Muslims. How can they
yeah.
accept that constitution?
Yeah. So that's basically, that's the downside of it. And a lot of people, I got in a bit of an argument on Twitter today, and well, it wasn't really an argument, to be fair, but I basically said that I joked. Okay, I was like, I can imagine Sardar Mohammad Dawood Khan is furious about this because he basically launched his coup d'état, declared a republic, all because this constitution really, really annoyed him. So 50 years later, for a bunch of mullahs from the south and the southeast to basically go back to this constitution is a bit of a slap in the face. But this guy was like, oh, Afrasiab Khatak predicted that the ISI were advising the Taliban on doing this because it's more internationally acceptable and whatever. And my first thought was, damn, the ISI give good advice, right? Right? Like, damn, it's pretty good advice.
Yeah,
But I said, like, Afrasiab Khatak is saying they want to make the Amir into a king, right?
yeah.
And I'm actually okay. There's a bit of a spoiler here. I've been reading a lot over the last week or 2 weeks about theories of rulership, Islamic theories of governance, right? The role of an emir, the role of a ruler, right? There's a classic book called Ahkam-sultaniyya. I'm reading Mufti Taqi Osmani's book. So this idea that you can just turn an emir, which is a very loaded concept throughout history, with 1,400 years of history, the way that you can just sort of transplant that onto a king, a secular king, by the
Yeah.
way, because kingship is a secular ideal, right? It, it's a very ignorant remark. But
I also think it's quite interesting that Afrasiab Khatak is seen as some sort of authority. Like, I mean, this guy, he his whole status as a politician is basically because in the 80s he was a guest of the communist regime. He was their pet in Kabul, and that's how he became an influential political leader because of the support and backing of the communists in Afghanistan. And then when he moved back to Pakistan and he became politically active in Awami National Party, he has always been that guy who supported U.S. occupation of Afghanistan, and we know what his political leanings are. We know what kind of ideas he has. Like yesterday, he was celebrating the death of Dr. Najib and glorifying him as some kind of hero. So if that's his politics, if that's his views, so how can we seriously even consider anything he has to say about Afghanistan? Because it's like to make it more simple for people to understand. Like, suppose if you have a politician in the Netherlands who during the Nazi occupation supported the Nazis, and then later on people refer to his views and opinions. So what does he has to say about this matter? Obviously,
what does Ja Rule have to
what
say?
does Ja Rule have to say about this
So
matter?
Elmo's actually raised a really decent point, saying Islamic history has kingship since the end of the Khulafa al-Rashidun. Even the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam told us about it. So how non-Islamic is it? That's a brilliant point. But what I'm referring to kingship here specifically is, so for example, Muawiyah radiallahu anhu and then Yazid and so on and so forth were kings, but they also held another office. Whereas the kind of kingship that I'm talking about is what Amanullah did in 1926. He changed his title from Amir to king. So Nadir and Zahir basically inherited that. So my point is that when we have that sort of background to the office of king, even though Zahir Shah on the Sakah, the coins that were minted in his name were Al Mutawakkil ala Allah, Muhammad Zahir Shah, which is a pretty nice uh pretty nice name. But the point is that we're sort of approaching Afrasiab Khatak is not really countenancing the fact that an Amir and that isn't a hereditary Amir, right? This isn't like Amir Amanullah, Amir Habibullah, Amir Abdurrahman. This is a different kind of emirate that we're talking about. Afrasiab Khatak is just completely flown over his head, and he's basically saying, the ISI have basically said, make Amir Haibatullah the king, essentially. Like, things are not that simple. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like, yeah, head of state, but it's not sort of that simple.
Yeah. So what's also relevant is to discuss. We've briefly mentioned the Shia. So in Afghanistan we have like 5-10%. I'm not sure exactly how many of the population are Shia. And among the Shia we have the 12er Imami Shia. We have the Ismailis. So these communities, they have existed in Afghanistan for centuries. What's important to note is that there was persecution of Shia during Amir Abdurrahman Khan, and that was entirely a thing, he, as a ruler, he made that decision based on his interests and his views at that time. Was that because he was a Sunni or because he was a Hanafi? Absolutely not. The same thing would apply to many other instances in history where there was oppression or persecution of minorities. We can also say, well, since 2001, the current government that was created in Afghanistan consisted primarily of many warlords. In Kabul, for example, the Sikh and Hindu community in Kabul, they had many properties. They had shops, houses, factories, whatnot. A lot of their property was taken from them by these warlords from Jamiat Islami. Now,
Enlightened progressives.
yeah, the National Resistance Front. Now, can we then say because they
resisting paying rent?
Yeah, because they took the land and the homes of the Sikhs, or we can say, oh, it's because they are Jamiat Islami, they are Ikhwanis, they are Tajik, or they're Sunni. Absolutely not. That wouldn't make any sense. They didn't do that because of their political ideology or their beliefs or their ethnicity. And the same thing applies to current situation in Afghanistan. If we have a constitution that says it's Islamic and it's Hanafi, etc., it doesn't necessarily mean that anything that happens now that is a violation of rights of minorities or anything, that is it is because of the Hanafi fiqh or Hanafi madhab. Or I think that we have to move away from this attitude of explaining things in this very shallow and simplistic manner. On the opposite side, we would also argue that in other parts of the world where there are persecution of minorities, like for instance in France, Muslims are being prosecuted, Islamic organizations are banned, Islamic publications are banned, women with hijab are not allowed to go to school. All of those things are currently happening in France. And is it because France is a secular nation state or because they're French? Some would say yes, but but we also have other secular nation states, and not all secular nation states are the same, and not everything can be just merely explained by, oh, it's because they're this or because they're that. We have to look at the whole picture. And the last thing that I think also is important, we have a major problem with Daesh in Afghanistan. And this is mainly because, we've discussed this in a previous episode, in a previous live stream. Salafi movement in Afghanistan is a small growing community. In Kabul and some other parts of the country, there are many Salafis, especially among the educated urban people. A lot of people adopt Salafism. And some of our viewers have commented about our previous show where we talked about Salafis, and they said, you are painting Salafis and Daesh with the same paint and you're saying that they are all the same. No, that's not what we are saying. What we do say is that Daesh is a offshoot of the broad umbrella, of Salafi movements, and some of the problems that emerge out of groups like Daesh can be explained by saying that it is a influence of Salafism. And not all Salafis become terrorists, and not all Salafis want to kill everyone just like Daesh. And that's why we have to have these conversations with Salafis without basically criminalizing all of them. But what I do see as a problem in Afghanistan with Salafis is that they say the Hanafi school of law is corrupt and deviant, and we need to go back to the original sources of Islamic law, which is Quran and Sunnah, the Hadith, and etc. And we need to interpret Islam according to the first three generations of Muslims. This kind of claim assumes that for the last thousand years, Muslims were basically ignorant. They were stupid. They didn't know anything, and that's why we have to go back and reinterpret everything according to the old teachings of Islam. And this kind of attitude creates problems. It creates problems because we have developed Islamic law for the last 1400 years, and all these books that have been developed about Islamic law, whether it's in India, the subcontinent, or in the Middle East, it's part of a vast sea of knowledge that we have, and it helps us to navigate in our current situation and in future. And in my opinion, what I have learned so far is that the Hanafi school is very pragmatic. It's very practical. It adapts to new situation, new environments. Like if you have a new development, new issue, and you want to know if there is any scholarly opinion about it, and if you start looking for it, you will notice that Ahnaf, they have already done some research. They have already written books about it. They have already issued fatwa about those matters, and this makes life easier for Muslims. It makes things practical, and for that reason, the Salafi approach is to basically no. We should throw away all these books, and then we should go back to the Quran and Hadith, and then reinterpret everything. And at the end of the day, what happens is that everyone becomes dependent on a few Salafi scholars, and we cannot have a modern and developed nation state in Afghanistan under current circumstances when we will have to basically go and reinterpret everything from zero. And this is also a similar situation that emerges when we have these modernists, these secularists who say, no Hanafi fiqh, no Hanafi fiqh. We will just make laws that are not contrary to Islam. And then you ask, okay, but how are you going to decide that? How are you going to make a distinction? There needs to be some sort of mechanism for that, and they just want to obfuscate that. And it's a way of basically having all the control, all the saying about what is going to be legal, what is going to be permitted, and what's not going to be permitted by them. So this is a similar attitude that both Salafis and the secularists have towards the position of Hanafi law in a society, in government, and in politics. And last thing that I would like to say is that we have a lot of modern Islamist movements like Hizb ut-Tahrir, we have the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, and all these political movements, they have this utopian idea of the ideal Muslim state. And that utopian idea is not what we want in Afghanistan. We don't want an Islamic state according to their utopian ideas. Afghanistan is an Islamic country. Everyone is Muslim, not everyone, most people are Muslim. Islam is basically part of our culture, habits, values, and everything. So the state should reflect that. Is that something crazy to demand or expect? It's not something really outlandish to say that.
Wait, no, I think if only we could just invade Afghanistan and like occupy it for 2 decades, fight, create a whole industry of like think tanks to demonize normative religious practice, kill a lot of people in the country. Wait, I think that's been tried.
They already tried.
Yeah. Sorry. Oh, sorry. If only. Okay. Fair enough. Yeah. You're right.
So that's the thing. I think what we need in Afghanistan is some sort of stability. Some sort of stability so that we can have economic development. And if we have economic development and if people become more prosperous, they will also have the ability to educate themselves. When people become more educated, overall, everyone benefits. A lot of our social and political problems will be resolved as long as we have some sort of stability. And with stability comes economic prosperity, and then we will move on, and maybe we can be part of the international community just like any other country, like whether it's Turkey, Pakistan, whatever. But we need to have stability, and we don't need experimentation, and we don't need to invent new matters. And that's why I feel like I feel some sort of relief because of this announcement. Because now I know what I'm dealing with. Now I know, okay, so this is what they have in mind, and we can actually criticize Taliban now based on that constitution. We can criticize them based on Hanafi fiqh. We can say, okay, you're doing this or you're doing that wrong, and that's bad. Why? Well, it's against the constitution. It's not in line with Hanafi fiqh. I can come up with a fatwa of a prominent Hanafi scholar from centuries ago and say, well, he said this and he said that. It enables people to actually engage Taliban about matters of governance, politics, social issues, anything. And we didn't have that, and now we have.
I think it is. I think it is. It is a positive step, in my opinion. I do view it sort of as being a good thing that they've done. It's still too early for me to be optimistic. Maybe you know what, you know, with the NRF thing, Sangar, like even after Panjshir was like fully cleared, I was like, you know what, until it's not resolved fully, I don't view it as a thing. So like that's my sort of perspective. I don't tend to get too optimistic about things. Like, I'm not going to be obviously critical about it. I think it was a good thing they've done. Too early to be optimistic for me, but what I think is very notable about this is that the defunct Mujahideen constitution of the 90s, which was basically, if you've studied Ikhwani ideology and the works of Sayyid Qutb, the defunct Mujahideen constitutions of the 1990s were shunned by the Taliban. Okay, they went back to the constitution, let's say a normative constitution, which did not see the state as being a tool through which to re-engineer society. That is a positive. Do you see what I'm saying? Whereas the 1990s constitutions basically sort of looked at it in the sense of the state that's exactly what the state is. And at the top of that constitution was who? Professor Saib Burhanuddin Rabbani. And the Taliban in the 1990s, they had a similar sort of approach to governance, it has to be said. So, you know, in the 1990s, Mullah Saib, Mullah Omar, a lot of the governance was basically done through decrees, which is, we can say to some extent, archaic. A decrees based, you know, the Amir issuing decrees is not, once again, societies evolve, countries evolve, politics evolves. Decrees cannot be used entirely to rule a whole country. So I think this is very positive, not just in the sense of we're going back to some sense of normalcy, but it's actually passing over the 90s, where the state and its relation to society is something that, on a personal level, is not something that I'm too comfortable with. I don't believe that the state's primary role is to make society in its own image. I believe, like you said, that a state should reflect the society and the values of the society over which it claims to govern, right? That is something the state should do. However, micromanaging people's behavior and not defining the limits of state power, and, you know, defining the limits of the state's power, delineating its relationship with the subject or with the citizen, I think those are really important things. So the fact that they've shunned the 90s, I think is a good step. And now I hope and I pray that the approach is, we are in government to provide security, to protect life, property, honor, to ensure fair commercial exchange, and to interact with the rest of the world on a respectable and equitable basis, whilst reflecting the values of the people that we claim to govern over. Um, so, yeah, it's that I would basically end it on that note. Abdul Latif Taimi is saying moderate Salafis have no issues with madhahib in principle. In fact, many are Hanbali. Fun fact, Khwaja Abdullah Ansari was Salafi and Hanbali and Sufi. Yeah, Abdul Latif, you're correct. But according to the orientalized image that we have of Hanbalis and Sufis, you would think that that is impossible. But I think even Sheikh Abdul Qadir Gilani was also
Hanbali.
Hanbali,
Yes.
Athari
Yes.
Hanbali, and obviously a Sufi to the
Yeah.
legendary level. So it's
Yeah. And we have another
yeah.
question. Uh, Daily Gamer says, I have been seeing reports from certain media outlets that Nuruddin Turabi will be enforcing private executions and amputation, wondering if these claims are very viable. So that was an interview with Turabi. Basically, they misquoted him. What he basically said, and I have talked to people and they basically verified that, he said that the Taliban will not get rid of hudud. Okay? So in Islamic law, Sharia is not just chopping off hands and legs, but contrary to popular belief,
Who would
yeah.
have thought?
But chopping off hands and legs is part of Sharia law. So it means that when there is a crime that has, when there is a punishment prescribed in Islamic law for, the punishment is execution or whatever, the Taliban are not going to remove that from their system of governments and their legal system, which is also the case in most other Islamic countries. Okay, I can only name maybe one or two countries that are Islamic, but they have basically removed those things. Even in non-Muslim countries, you have executions. They don't chop off hands of people, but they do execute people, and that's the thing. Turabi didn't say that he wants private courts where he can privately go and punish people. that's that's
Toba.
that.
Toba. Can you they picked a really scary picture of him for that article as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah, so like with one eye, you see, this is all part of an attempt to basically create the scariest image as possible. And
The background was like pitch black
yeah,
as well,
yeah,
by the
yeah,
way.
yeah. So yeah, and with regards to moderate Salafis,
I'm sorry, but that is the fact that they basically
yeah,
try. Yeah, I shouldn't be
yeah,
laughing,
but with
but
regards to moderate Salafis, the thing with moderate Salafis is that I wouldn't use the word moderate because it's a very bad word. I don't like it. There are different strands of Salafism. So in Saudi Arabia, the law of the land is Hanbali. Okay? So whether you follow Hanbali madhab or don't, the law of the land is Hanbali. So the courts in Saudi Arabia, when they decide about any matter, the way they interpret law is based on Hanbali madhab. So what does that mean is that the Hanafi, Hanbali, Maliki, and Shafi schools have their methodology of how to arrive at a certain ruling. And they're very similar with each other in many ways, but they have some minor nuances, differences. And that's why you have in the Gulf and Saudi Arabia, you have predominantly Hanbali court system, legal system, and in Afghanistan you have Hanafi. That doesn't mean that the Salafis in Saudi Arabia are all Hanbali, but the court system is. And the same thing should be also the case in all other Islamic countries, because most people in Indonesia are Muslim, and most Muslims in Indonesia follow the Shafi school of thought. So it wouldn't make sense to go to Indonesia and say, if you want to have Islamic laws here in this country, you should have Hanafi's interpretation. Doesn't make sense.
By the way, there's something interesting to note here. So, in I mentioned Asas al-Qazat, Abdurrahman Khan. In areas where Hanafi law was lacking, he actually used, or the judges actually used or resorted to Maliki law. So it just has to be noted that the relationship between these schools of thought is not sort of characterized generally by sort of hostility. There is, even in that, there's sort of a pragmatism,
Yeah.
right? Where, okay, if they have something and that they've done better than us, we'll just basically bring that over here, which is what what Napoleon did with Maliki law. So these things it's not sort of a belligerent stance that's held, despite, modern movements and what they do sort of say. You mentioned the Saudis invite Mufti Taqi Osmani to consult with him. So yeah, it's not, I think it's just important for people to realize these are not sort of opposing camps on different sides.
Yeah.
Rather, they just have different methodological procedures by which they arrive at conclusions.
Exactly.
Sometimes some do it better than others, and even they would accept that with you. So yeah. I've got one last question. Five Lions are saying we have so many schools of Islam in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, majority do not go to school. These schools of thought cannot school the thoughts of our women right now. Yeah, I'm sorry, man. I really don't know what point you're trying to. Walaka, I'm not even trying. Like, I don't know
basically,
what that
I
is,
think he's
but
trying to say that the Taliban are not allowing women to go to school, so it doesn't really matter which school of law they follow. They're not allowing women to go to school.
oh, okay, fair enough. Yeah, valid. In that case, valid point. I think is very bad, very very unwise from the
You still
Taliban.
want to travel back to Afghanistan, so you need to be careful with your
Yes.
words.
Yeah. But yeah, in any case, I think we should wrap it up. So, to everyone that is,
I can't hear you, bro. You disconnected your microphone. Yeah, now I can hear you again.
okay, so I'm wrapping it up, Sangat. It's a public service announcement. Please do feel free to chip in if you can, or if you want. But essentially, guys, this was a live stream after a while. First of all, sorry for the fact that the live stream, it happened late due to technical problems, as well as the fact that we haven't done a live stream in a while. But this is something that I and Sangat always shamelessly say. We are freelancers. We work full time. And we also have technical problems. Now, here's the thing. As far as I can see across the Anglosphere, there are not many people sort of discussing these things in depth, willing to discuss the history, the epistemology, and so on and so forth behind these things. And right now, we are currently at a crossroads in that the mainstream media, the global media, the entire business surrounding Afghanistan has never been as discredited as it is at the moment. And that is because a lot of the things that we were being told for the last 20 years basically got proven wrong in 11 days. Now, if you believe in a platform that doesn't cater to global sensitivities and taboos, but actually just reflects the aspirations and the voices and the perspectives of Afghans, right? If you don't want to forfeit the ground back to global media to once again dominate the coverage and offer you the same skewed perspective that they gave you for the last 40 years, if you do believe in a platform that is not associated with any large organization or state entity, that is run by two freelancers who work full time, who are now going to go to sleep because they need to wake up tomorrow to work at 9 a.m., then please share our content. I noticed there are 75 people here right now. Unfortunately, the likes are not corresponding with that, which is the source of much anger for me. So please like the video, share our content. I want everyone who has not shared on social media at the moment to do that at the moment, so other people, this one was a relatively short live stream, so other people can actually see the history of constitutionalism in Afghanistan. Um, and yeah, subscribe to our YouTube channel, of course. And if you do agree with the cause in general and want to empower us to be able to offer more content and more coverage and more analysis on a level where we can compete with other organizations that are more reputable than us, that have more money, that have more support than us, if you want us to compete with those, please consider becoming patrons on our Patreon, sending us super chats or PayPal. And that is all I'm going to say. Thank you very much to everyone that has joined. Sangar, خدای شفا در
I
کی
mean,
داوری خود دیتی تو
I
خبر.
mean, thank you very much. Thank you guys for being with us. Have a good night. Wassalam.
وعلیکم السلام.